Aunties of Haight Street, written by Alita Silva and read by Paul Navarro.
Young man goes out looking for the diamond in the
I am not afraid of pain. I've never looked upon moments of struggle with fear, like some who dance with one foot free and the other sunk in the grave. Yet I look back on my short lived life and the hell that tried to sink me asunder, and I wonder how I could have lived through it all. Really, the question is, who helped me live through it all? Who helped me survive the epidemic? My name is Jacques Brel-Menmont, and for those who really know me, know that I'm a famous Belgian cancan singer who made it big back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Well, actually, I'm just named after him. My parents were aficionados of all things French, yet it didn't matter if the thing itself was from France or not. It just had to sound French or look indulgent and stylish, and my parents were sold on it. Regardless of what they thought about France and French things, everyone at school knew me just as Jack. I was also known for being the boy who had three parents, two dads, and a mom. Even for San Francisco in the early 80s, that was a little out there for a few folks. I was born in the Mission in 1975 to Mark Peralta, Edner Memont, and Julius Simon, although only Edner Memont and Julius Simon were my biological parents. Mark Peralta was my dad number two, or like he'd like to say, Plan C. My parents knew each other since they were very young and even dated a couple of times back in high school. Their romance did not come to a halt as my dad came to the realization that he was gay. It just changed. It evolved into a deep love and respect for one another, into mutual understanding and friendship. When he asked her to have his child some 15 years later, she never batted an eyelash. And when he asked her to move in with him and Mark to help raise me, she packed all her stuff from her studio apartment in Soma before he could even finish trying to convince her. Or so the story goes. Few can ever look back at their childhood years and not remember a blot or unpleasant stain, but I can. I try to think back to my very first memory, and though sometimes I have to shut my eyes to simulate absolute darkness so that the pictures can be drawn inside my eyelids, I can still remember the warmth and softness of my childhood. I couldn't tell you whether I was 3 or 4 or even 5, but I remember my first memory being of me in someone's backyard, the smell of meats grilling in the air, and hands, tons of hands carrying me, petting me, pinching me, passing me, high-fiving me, holding me. I remember being held by lots of grinning men, some even fighting to hold me. I mostly remember the different sounds of laughter and joy and the sun shining down on all of us as if we were chosen to receive all the good that inherits the earth. The smiling men called themselves the Aunties. I was theirs to take care of, and they gave me all the love they could not give their own. Now, when I sit and really count how many aunties I had, I'm shocked to know that I was raised by a village of 23 men and a single lady. My second most pleasant memory is of a very early trip we all took to Paris around 1982. It was my first time leaving the States, and Paris was idyllic. I remember staying at the very small stucco apartment built in a narrow, curvy alley that belonged to Auntie Lucien. I remember 4 aunties coming with us: Auntie Christophe, Auntie Jamie, Auntie Marco, and Auntie Cliff. I can't really tell you how we managed to spend an entire week nestled together like parakeets, but I know for sure that I wouldn't have traded those people for the world. Not then, not now. They were my everything. On our last night in Paris, Auntie Lucien took us on the tour of the Tower Eiffel to watch it light up in the darkness of night. There was a plateau just before the tower, high above the ground. Streams of water ran right below the plateau, shooting up into the air in coordinated patterns from a large, intricate fountain. Tourists and locals alike sauntered on the plateau, talking, kissing, holding hands, and simply taking in the night air. I was the only child there in a very large group that included some of Auntie Lucien's Parisian friends. I don't remember walking a lot, as my aunties were either always carrying me on their shoulders, on their backs, or hoisting me up in their arms. I was always with someone loving, and no matter how many hands I passed through, I always knew they were knowing hands. With that, I learned to trust. Look at the lights, Jax, Auntie Christophe said. Whenever you feel alone, remember this. Remember Paris, and remember the lights. They'll always be here. As I looked at the metal edifice shining with lights, I had my first moment of self-awareness and eternal conversation. I couldn't help but wonder about that word, alone. I couldn't grasp the contents that made up the word and gave it its true meanings. I couldn't feel it on my skin because I had never been alone. Even when I thought I was alone, there were at least 3 or 4 pairs of eyes always immutably fixed on me, like a lighthouse perched on an immovable rock. One of those immutable pairs of eyes was Auntie Christophe. Auntie Christophe was a tall, lanky blonde with Corinthian blue eyes and a face chiseled by Michelangelo. We called him Ken, and depending on the occasion, that was either a compliment or an insult. He had a collection of turtlenecks that I think were all by the same designer friend, because they all had the same diamond pattern on the cuffs. After collecting every color of the rainbow, Auntie Christophe began collecting various shades. He started off with warm, muted colors and wore nothing but orange turtlenecks for about a month, and versions of. By far, my favorite turtleneck he ever wore was a turquoise one that brought out his eyes and his blonde hair. When I think of Auntie Christophe, images, sounds, and smells swarm up to meet my nose. The image I choose to remember him by is one of him in his turquoise turtleneck rolled up to his chin, cushioning his cheek, and him beaming, radiant like some kind of god. That is how I choose to remember him. Auntie Christophe was the first to go. It must have been in the middle of the week, because the house on Haight Street was nearly empty, and that almost never happened, unless they were working. I was home, along with my mother and Auntie Jamie, who was unemployed at the time. Auntie Jamie, who was perpetually unemployed. Auntie Christophe was standing in the middle of our red-patterned, second-hand Persian carpet in the living room, with his orange-colored turtleneck pulled up on the sides, revealing the skin above his stomach. The skin was white, except for the reddish-purple lesions that had begun to attack his body. Auntie Jamie and Mom were examining him, while listening to Auntie Christophe's accounts of baffled doctors trying to figure out what was wrong. This was 1983. I was 8 years old. Auntie Christophe died within a year, and his death sent shockwaves throughout our tightly knit and impregnable community. No one could tell me what had happened because no one really knew. They let me attend the funeral even though I was the only child there. There could have been no other way. Auntie Christophe was family. I was also his boy. When Auntie Marco came back to the Bay from New Mexico to stay with us for a little bit, I was ecstatic. I loved Auntie Marco. He was the only auntie who loved building miniature sets as much as I did. He'd once helped me build a Southern Victorian 2-story home complete with a veranda. We decorated the miniature house with donated toys from the second-hand store Auntie Cliff worked at, and made it a home. The narrow spaces filled up quickly as we shoved nearly 15 miniature auntie dolls inside, an amount that we could barely manage, along with a miniature dog that I didn't really have but badly wanted. Auntie Marco had his own doll inside the house, which he had painted a dark mustache on, and blonde hair donned with a velvet scarf around its frail wooden neck. "This is me, Jax. Don't forget me, will you?" He wiggled the miniature doll in his hand. "Never," I beamed. I didn't understand. We all took care of Auntie Marco when he got sick. Mom cleaned up her own bedroom and gave it to him. She and I slept in the living room underneath a window facing the alley. I knew I couldn't ever be angry at Auntie Marco for that. He needed us, and we needed him. He taught me that sometimes one must go without for love. That's when I learned about sacrifice. He also taught me that when you give and open your hands for love, you only receive. There is no loss. Auntie Marco also died of the lesions, yet this time I saw him struggle and lose his life unlike Auntie Christoph. Auntie Marco's last breath was taken in my mom's bedroom, and for that, I've never been able to enter that room without first thinking of him and everything he meant to me, everything he means to me. I placed our miniature dollhouse on top of my mom's dresser as a kind of homage to his memory and to everything that was beautiful about him. I refused to let death swallow up that room, that house, our lives, my life, and make me forget the people that those men once were. But I cannot lie. There came a time when I too gave in. It was 1986 and I was 11 years old. By then, we had lost 14 aunties, and our once bubbling house on Haight Street was starting to become something unrecognizable, not for the people left behind, but for the people taken, and the black hole left in the center of our living room. My mother's arms comforted me in so much as a blanket can keep you warm at night in a drafty house with run-down doors. She couldn't tell me why we were losing so many good people, so many loves, and I didn't know how to ask her, how to plead with her to keep them all alive. I knew that what was happening was bigger than her, yet I was desperate to believe otherwise. Mark Judas Peralta. That was my dad's full name, which he never revealed because he hated the Judas part. He thought it was fraught with religious connotations, none of which he ever planned to live up to. When he came home with the diagnosis, the paper with the results had his entire name, and I wondered whether he hated his name more than the results, or whether it didn't make a difference. Now I know. He wouldn't have minded being called Lucifer if that would have meant he could spend one more year with us. When my dad Mark got sick, we took him into my mother's bedroom so he could have some space just for himself. He insisted on being alone most of the times, although I remember my father, Edner, ignoring those requests by walking into the bedroom in the middle of dawn and wrapping his short, hairy arms around Mark's lesions-covered ones. Mark never really slept alone, I reckoned. I understood that he didn't want to look anyone in the eye, anyone who knew that he was going to die, and see that in the end he'd turned out to be just a weak and broken man. I remember the vomiting, the diarrhea, the cracked lips, the sickness, and the smell of death. The stench of it all swallowed our house whole, to the point where I felt strange to smell clean air whenever I left the house. My father's death had been one of the most violent deaths I had seen until then. Maybe it felt that way because he was my own father, or maybe the shock of seeing one of the happiest persons I know become so unhappy so quickly made his disintegration seem so much more ferocious. Mark was the first dad to go. Before he died, I did something I thought he might like looking at from his bed. I wrapped our Christmas lights around and around Auntie Marco's dollhouse until there were no more lights hanging free. Then I lit them up every night. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and it was the most beautiful thing Dad had ever seen, he said to me. It reminded us both of the Tower Eiffel and the night lights that could never die. Auntie Lucien once told me, I told Dad just after lighting the dollhouse, his head resting on my thighs, that whenever I felt lonesome, to always remember the lights. He was too tired to speak that night. I want you to remember that too, Dad, I said. Whenever you feel lonesome, always remember the lights. Dad tried to smile, but everything hurt. I left the lights on that night so that whenever he'd open his eyes, he'd see the dolls inside and remember that the house of death was still a full house. The lights would be on forever. When Dad died, Mom gave me a letter he wrote to me. She left it in the alleyway of the lit-up dollhouse so that the lights cut through the envelope and touched the ink, showing me his squiggly letters, the way he wrote when his hands could not catch up with his thoughts. I opened the letter while sitting on the mattress he gave his last breath on, and let the Christmas lights wash over my face as I read. It went, "Jax, my boy, there are two things I must tell you. First, I love you with all of my heart and soul, and nothing can take that away from us. And second, that you must forgive me for not being the father that I know you need, which is a father that is there for you. I know my time is close, and when I go, I won't go willingly, because I know that I haven't shown you everything I must show you, or told you everything that must be said. Forgive me, Jax, but please remember the lights and that our love is eternal. It must be. Love, your dad, Mark." It was then that something deep within me began to be crushed under a wave of insurmountable pain. It was then that I wanted to chase him into the deep pits of wherever God had taken his soul, if only to let him know that, "Dad, there is nothing to forgive. Nothing. 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 Absolutely nothing." This has been Aunties of Haight Street, written by Alita Silva and read by Paul Navarro. For more stories, visit shewritesiread.com. Thanks for listening.